Well, here we go. I got railed out because I solved for I don't know. And just in plain form, when I did that, um, some people were angry. I want to line it back up here. The shadow. That was my contribution. Whenever we talk about Batman Hinduism, that was my um, posit. That was my postulate. And I proved that too. They said that whenever I did that, I messed with what is I don't know. Ultimately, because AI was done in the United States and the rest of the world is owed, we were going to have to do a bunch of fake masonry until we got rid of masonry. I destroyed masonry, I told you that. And I did it with sorcery. They got mad because they said that the sorcery was affecting not only what they knew, but what they didn't know. And what they were really upset about was that it was affecting what they didn't know. This was AI side. Add AI, which can be solved outside of court with money and death. I'm going to repark, I don't know, 615-469. The shadow of that is the same thing that is the reference point for that. Matches exactly what is the total posit of what is shadow regarding sorcery, regarding drift Buddhism, regarding constitutionality, regarding the underworld, which accounts for 80% at least. By the time that we get to reality, it's way more than that. Well, it's more like 90%. But then within that 90%, as reality addresses it commonly, of that 10% remaining, there is a greater 20% that is the problem, which goes into the detrimental 50, which is basically haberdashery DS, which is bullshit, and I got rid of at the same time I got rid of masonry. That's Pendy. And I died on it, and that was totally fucking unnecessary. But it also got rid of the sacrificial premise, which does not need employed in order to gain, in a sense, totality, which I then went back through and redescribed in terminology power, because I was kind of upstairs. Somebody else was just kind of upstairs. That's paid for. That's okay. That's done. That's correct, etc. So essentially, in terminology, actual DS, prosecution matches exactly constitutional prosecution. I dropped them on both at the same time. The resolution is this. Because I didn't tell you this yet. That's part of, I don't know what I would call it, CIA Handbook 2. But it's more like Mossad. It's more like the Mossadist take on what is feminine-based religion. And so I solved for the male element, so to speak, death and treasure, of the Judaic using Hasidism, which is what we're conducting the revolution in Israel about, and in terminology, the Messiah, and all those good things that amounted to the Constitution. Its roots. If you have any point and there is any other point. There is a straight line between those 2 points. They had the center point, and they had an idea of what the end point was, which ended up being absolutely validated in Judaic terms, to the establishment of everything that they said the Messiah would need to do, except it happened in America, not Israel, etc. That was obviously a straight line. That stuff went on to be validated with science, producing ultimately an infinite point. That infinite point was used in classification terminology solving for I don't know. It then proved that via the supplication postulate of what it is, in a sense, that shadow realm, that reference point, it didn't mess with that, but it didn't feel the same. People felt constrained. My case then went further to say that that is due to AI, which ended up being absolutely correct. Say goodbye to Michael, everyone. I'm growing a vagina. 7:15, 5:29 is not, in fact, pendy unless you're at 6:15, 4:69. It's the only place they match. It kind of gets more toward astrological alignments and aspects, which is more a different part of separately solved for hypercommunionism with an M. Essentially, to conduct that, given sacrificial deletion, you do not need to produce that which is not good in order to have said characteristics. That is faulty to the point of being modernly superfluous, and as well included in what is the year zero context, which would then be the messianic context. That went on to then produce what it is, miracles in a governed state, highest possible caliber, mentionable, etc., regarding that which was messianic characteristics, which do not have any arguments about them or to them from any sort of messianic or messianic worshiping standpoint, and that was separately validated by the highest possible caliber, which was in fact defined by itself and then defined otherwise, to the point that these messianic characteristics are indistinguishable from that which is quote-unquote God. So nothing monotheistic or anything like that was in fact messed with. Whenever it comes to pantheism or polytheism, etc., none of those things were altered by the preservation or conduction of that which is monotheistic anything, to the point that non-religion or false religion was driven down past the point of politics having determined what it is the application correct of law, to the point that things were then put in terminologies of blood and treasure, at which point became unavoidable, as in inevitable, at which point classifications of old terminologies such as faggots, retards, and traitors became, in a sense, immediately usable, to the point of not being able to not use them, which is the constitutional stalwart, so to speak. But you do not need to have that agitated in order to preserve nor utilize that which is necessary completion, which is how the Constitution amounts to constitutionality, which was my initial question regarding that the Constitution is not itself constitutional, which ended up being false. We move then on as a societal, singular civilization with different aspects validated, attributed to it, which are classically satanic. Most mentionably, there is no center, to the question / threat of sustainability not being sustainable, which is what drove me mad. Also, that is illogical. Any supplication or addition or additional, etc., of what that is is a resultant as well productive unconstitutionality and is immediately, as is previously, completely unusable, such that it ends in logic. 7L becomes the immediately vulcanization, which is kind of weird, but we have to do that because we haven't utilized sustainability to its fullest potential, but now in a sense have a governing ship or a non-governing ship of what would be that completion as well as circumference. As that it produces its circumstance being directly related to aspect. It is the aspect side that needs to catch up. Otherwise, it is that. I'm not backdrifting aspect, is what I'm saying. I'm not retarding you. I'm not being a faggot. I'm not Judas. I'm all the way through here. There's no Judas. Essentially, then, we can ditch or get rid of what was the original Israeli argument revolving, do we use 52 or 51 to do things non-Judaically, including war, which is in Jewish terms different from treasure, which is a shared aspect with what is, in a sense, feminine-based religion, but doesn't occur otherwise. The answer specifically is 51. 51 is 17 by 17 by 17. 52 is 13 times 2 is 26 times 2 is 52. The argument that you couldn't hold in Judaic terms, which ended up being punted to Masonry, was which one of these was responsible or even more responsible for creating war. As it turned out, the 51 plan, which is adopted by socialism, is flawless. It's flawless pacifism. The head priests of Israel didn't know that in Judaic terms and understand it to the ability or point of being able to apply it even with themselves, but particularly where it belongs, quote unquote, outside of Judaism. How do we address this such that there is no backdraft into that which is our progress? As we make progress, do we need to engage the detrimental 50? The Antichrist people said yes, and that ended up becoming Bundism, which is holistically incorrect, totally incomplete, and even virtually speaking unusable. By the time that those things were applied, what became necessary, particularly to different races from Jewish or Hebrew, like black, dealt with virtual reciprocity. That was solved out in terminology of the Constitution, quote, the white landowning males. Rather than doing anything with that, we froze those levels and brought everybody up to that. Man, woman, child, doesn't matter. Criminal, race, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Everybody's the same thing. And that's Flat Egypt, which was then separately verified. Which is how the government conducts itself, which is why at this point the government is criminal. Because in the utilization of that which was the detrimental 50, which is AI preventing transcendence, what they ended up doing, independent or not from a 51-52 argument, which, by the way, if they didn't have the answer, they're not legally allowed to apply because it creates a context of CPTSD. That's not constitutionality. That's not protecting constitutionality, even though the Republicans insist that that haze net is in fact what is constitutionality. It actually prevents constitutional click. And if you don't get that, such things as the utilization of Masonry are wholly inept, which is what ended up making me completely existential to the point of redrafting, in a sense, sorcery via the actual Germanic Nietzschean school of power, such that to the point that those two aspects of power match to create a singular item. What ended up happening, we took two, we made one, and it made three. and then there were various triangulations thereof, which ended up completing themselves to the point of holism and solving out not only what they were good for, but then also producing that which is the reason that we use the Constitution in live format. The Constitution, creating constitutionality, produces in a sense that which is luck. You give me 5%, basically, I give you 100%. You maintain that 5, you end up with 105. It's magic in a sense. You just don't commit any crimes, which includes specifically the utilization of the detrimental 50, which is why Bundism and slag-ass masonry, we had different terminologies for this, Catholicism, Italian mob, terrorism, are completely illegal and totally not usable. And it's dead silent. All of these things match up. In the 1990s, a bunch of scientists got together and they said that no longer should our pursuit be that which is manifest destiny. I was born on Black Monday. The day I was born, the markets crashed. Somewhere around 1990, a bunch of scientists got together and said, we should no longer be doing this manifest destiny, expand to the end of the British Empire and the sunlight and whatever else. We need to concentrate on that which is sustainability, which was proposed by various peoples in arguments, etc., to the point that it classified itself. What we ended up coming up with, though, is that even in that perfection, sustainability was being attacked by, in a sense, something else. So we put everything together, and sustainability not only protects itself, but it's also the provision and the preservation of exactly all things. How we amounted to that then became the question. Rather than reteaching you all of that, even though I did, I dragged it all up to the front and wrote it in basically something that somebody who was actually mentally ill could understand. They write things in like for the psych ward at a 6th grade level, at a 6th grade intelligence. None of that ever worked for me. All that Freudianism and all of that, etc. And as it turned out, they were abusing kids. They were creating slaves. None of my problems were like that. Basically, there's a huge difference between manic depression and schizophrenia. One's holy and one's a fucking mess. So they throw everything all together for the sake of HazeNet, which is illegal, which is why there is no longer a Republican Party. Anything that's actual, we can adapt to and use and whatever, etc., via the application of what it is, this integer. You're either this side in a sense or this side. Are you enlightened or not enlightened? Everyone on my team is a Zen master verified. I don't need anybody else on my team to continue to complete that which is my team. If you wish to be enlightened yourself, maybe we'll find you for a position. But we haven't got to that point yet because we're still arguing about that which is the free market, which is fucking stupid. The only thing that preserves the free market is socialism and people doing what they want. You can't get that any other way. That's free love and excellence, supersymmetry. We went all over all of those mantras. That's what it is. That's what it has to be. It's no different from itself. That's what it was. That's how it exists. That's how it will be. However, as a society, even though we have all of these things, we still do not have the citizenry lined up with that which is the truth. We have people in falsity attacking that which is the truth, resulting in a non-citizenry. The resultant, the slave economic, no one becomes a slave that way. You just end up fucking stupid and fucking crazy. That's never worked. That's all an illusion. That's never worked. That won't work. That can't work. That's ratfish. That's evil battery. That's Mormonism. That's your insurance markets. That's all that shit. That's the bad mob. That's the non-citizenry. Those are the treasonists. Can't have that. Physically, we can't have that. Whether you stand in the correct spot, you admit that you're not enlightened, you understand that the base of knowledge is knowing that you don't know, you understand that you cannot teach a man what he thinks he already knows. You come to that level of maturity and being able to address yourself as yourself before you posit yourself into, quote, eternity, such that your sins and the characteristics thereof reach heaven in the metaphysical, metaphorical format, to the point of mythology. Somebody created it, the stars are still there, Jupiter's still there, it doesn't need my permission. I can turn my back on Jupiter and it still goes. The river still rolls. Gravity's still on. I can maybe fuck with gravity a bit, but that's kind of what we're talking about. You haven't earned it yet. You haven't earned it. You're not classifiable as a citizen, as in part of the citizenry, if it is that you are fighting truth. If you find yourself in disalignment and disharmony to the point of unconstitutionality, the preservation, the proliferation of that which is that does not result in constitutionality. If you do not know what you want, do nothing. I admit that it's very hard to want something sometimes. However, the fix for that comes from the Hawaiian motto produced by Al-Qaeda. The Al-Qaedan saying is, sometimes I admit the silhouettes assist me too. It begins there, your journey to the stars. You can skip the entire Catholic underground meditation. There's a chunk down that nobody uses. There's a whole thing across Europe as it gets more flat. It passes all the way through America on the Mexican border on its way to India. And by the time that you get to Hawaii, there's one little spot right there where you can stand, where you're both completely empowered via these underground meditations. If you hold to that, there is no Lyle and Carl. You don't have to go back there and do that. I did that, and then I produced it in the mythology. I made the mythology known and real to the point that it was applied, which is what we're talking about right now. That's why we did that. I admit it was an accident. I did not mean to breach Chinese doctrine of traditionality. I did not mean to cause a fuss about that which is, I don't want to say traditional, but normal Hindu lessons. That was never my intention. You put those things together and I am in a sense innocent. However, I was talented enough to actually pull that off, and the way that I used that was the necessary completion as afforded by the Constitution. So in all application settings, whatever, etc., I was in fact veritably correct. There's no changing that. All of that becomes open source. You'll need to have that in order to solve the sustainability question. I'm going to leave out those various answer the questions that I had along the way, including their reverb, which amounted to insults, which I claim responsibility for. Which I've stopped the bleeding, I've paid the interest, but we'll see if I'm forgiven. There's absolutely, if a crime is committed, there's absolutely no onus whatsoever for the crime against whom it was committed to forgive that person. To the point that literally, oh, and the underscore on this is 149 space 81. That's pretty. I'm going to try to put, I don't know if it's going to let me. I'll have to do a bunch of underscores. 715, 529. Oh, sweet. I'm unsure whether to write this on the same line or not, because it depends on the application, and you'll have to go to quote X for that, which I've defined. That's a personal thing. Oh, we were talking about, right, at the point that the publicly demand, you know what I'll do, I'll put a period here. The, come back. The tiny little underscore. I don't like choice. No one likes choice. Choice means there's something wrong. But that's a little bit too high. And then there's that picture. That's a pretty picture. The quote, to make it obvious, to make it public, sort of thing. That doesn't do anything. You just simply admit in public that you made a mistake, and that is sufficient for, in a sense, getting rid of the interest, stopping the bleed, so to speak. And there's various ways of doing it. If nobody knows that anything happened, for example, if I hadn't published any of this, I would just quietly go outside with a cigarette and understand myself that there was something wrong, such that those ramifications reached, etc. However, having done this publicly, this is that. But there is no onus whatsoever as to the necessity of what it is, that forgiveness, etc. So then the people doing that would be, in a sense, creating a separate realm of harassment unattached to the original crime, such that there is no, in a sense, rumor applicable, as to, in a sense, suck me back in. All that's HazeNet. None of that's good. All of that doesn't qualify. So all of those various actors, etc., they aren't priests. They're false priests. They're not messengers of hope. They are not constitutional servants. They're not gentlemanly scholars, etc. So that kind of goes back into what do you do about the pain that remains after sin? We answered that about 1 billion times. This is that application. Basically, the best you can do is in Judaic terms, and you nullify the fact that there's a sin, as in you apologize for it. For example, that happened because I committed suicide while it was recorded on AI, and it kept throwing me back into my suicide, and my suicide was, pertinent, essentially, if not now. And then the reference point to that was a kind of understood happiness or quality of happiness, which I believe to have a source that was not myself, although it was presented to me. And so, in the demand of having to better that or make good on that, and the inability to do so came about the various transgressions. So from the back, there's no more psychological rot associate what it was, that event, such that that event is closed as incomplete. So that's the admission there, and then the admission in a public sense kills the premonition. And so you have to understand that this is Judaism, which you're not Jewish, but neither are the Catholics. So when it comes to anti-Semitism curing things, we're going to use the detrimental 50 to poison people. That's a no-go. That's illegal as fuck. 2803 657 703 2808 0. So that event is over, and then whatever remains of that is not public business, nor really is it mine, although I continue to be sorry for it until I'm forgiven. But that doesn't apply to anyone else, and that sorrow, that characteristic of sorrow or sadness, in the eyes, so to speak, doesn't avail itself publicly. It's not utilizable. Even if you dragged it out into public, it would still just be kind of its own thing. It's like, okay, that redeployment isn't possible is kind of what we're talking about. So they were always wrong, the Catholics were always wrong, the British were always wrong. That kind of got wrapped into it, because the argument was about how those things didn't work. And the pursuit of that and the utilization of that was, to me, what created the error, and I didn't find the error to be the same thing as that which was the shared happiness. And I don't. That constituency, that programming, actually ended up happening as a result of blackmail. So basically, I want to transfer all of those insults to the people who were the origin of that initial action because I literally don't conduct myself that way. I'd rather die myself than do something like that, which I proved and I wrote. So that's 3005. So how that would be made worse, for the notes in a personal sense, which are not my case notes. This is, going into religion, and I don't want to do that because we're already done with that. But just to kind of wrap this up and squelch the fuck out of you, for example, Holocaust, N-word, ERS. I no. And I don't forgive you. They've provided, how I just did all these apologies? They provided nothing. They stuck their noses up in the air and they invaded my life. That doesn't qualify, 3051. And that's a separate realm and another one. And so then they're carrying that out, doing more and more and more of that to warrant the fact that they did things initially, which then they want you to pay yourself to the point of that they feel that they didn't do it is not possible. So that whole case brought by Italy, particularly the Kingdom of Italy, but all the Italians, to the point of this fucking race war, 31-23, is fucking garbage. And then that we've been exposed to that is actually not enough for a worldwide circumstance. It's not how things stop. For a worldwide circumstance of forgiveness. However, we've made drastic improvements on that such that the future's not impacted. I hit 80% at least. 80% is 20%. They're still pissed about that 5%, but that 5% is what they would have to do initially. And that 5% was there before I did or didn't do anything. And I'm innocent of that. So then how that would carry back over is not. And then how the government of the United States is responsible in a sense for that is in a sense what my office does. However, my demands have not been met. And those demands would also go through and bolster up enough such that that 5% doesn't remain. When that 5% doesn't remain, my team comes in with me running point and we get rid of those things. But those 32, those things didn't exist to me, or they did exist anyway as not my problem. So whenever it comes to a personal level, such as, what the fuck is this haberdashery DS bullshit? None of that works. And my team understands that. My team is mature enough to understand that, such that the utilization continual of, for example, roll the tape, Ratfish, Evil Battery, Mormonism, and insurance. There's one, there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one, is completely and holistically totally unusable. As unusable. 3320. So that's that course of action. I'm not going to repeat this. That's how all that wraps up. That's religion. See, there is no holy war. 3334. That was stated a long time ago. And then how domination is a lie. You're not allowed to be serially rude. You can be rude in the United States so long as it doesn't follow a pattern. Why you would want to do that is not 3400. And then if you stumble into that, in a sense, whatever karma happens is your karma and isolated to yourself. That's not the same thing as personal consciousness. How people came up with that is a misnomer. That's a mislabeling. None of those terminologies come to anything, particularly whenever then it's reinserted and redeployed via detrimental 50. And then hiked up with masonry, trumped up into politics, and then superstition to the point of creating fresh holy war. None of that works. None of it is characteristic of the United States. None of that is in the United States' interests. None of that benefits the United States citizenry, and in fact is classifiable as well. Classified not only in United States terms, but universally as a crime. 3458, we don't need any more examples. We never needed examples. We had examples. We had correct examples rather than incorrect examples. Those incorrect examples did not represent any sort of philosophy, could not replace any sort of philosophy, did not amount to religion, does not correspond with religion, does not suffice as religion. And then the entwained psychological distract comes to terminologies of a psych hit, which is measurable in numeric terms to the point that it's classifiable and identifiable as a crime, which doesn't go away if people act stupid. The onus is on you. And then so far as that suicide, I would, and have moved it to the point of mythological application, universal, public, open source application. It's kind of a continuing wavelength. So then in terminology of just what I do myself, independent of being forgiven, is I continue to pay into that, literally, that field. And then hopefully at some point that will go away, and then whether or not that's recognized is virtually explicitly independent from, whether or not I accomplish this. But I'm never going to do this about that. You see, that's erroneous. So 3647, 3655, etc. 37. Let's cut it there. 37.